Warning, the following podcast has been classified as insanely lucrative. Listener discretion is advised.
Don't buy iPhones, don't buy Nike shoes, don't buy Xbox controllers. Those companies control their supply chain quite well.
Yeah.
Your attention, please. Listening to the AM/PM podcast may cause recurring revenue streams and unfair advantages over your competitors. Other side effects may include fatter wallets, fired bosses, and longer vacations. Listen at your own risk. Here's your host, seven-figure entrepreneur and online marketing madman, Manny Coates. Manny Coates.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the AM/PM podcast. My name is Manny Coates, and I will be your host. And this is the show where we discuss how to generate recurring revenue streams 24 hours per day during the AM and the PM, hence the name of the show. Get it? AM/PM podcast. As a matter of fact, I was just watching that movie, Into the Woods. I know it's not quite brand new, but I hadn't seen it, and it was pretty interesting how they mixed Jack and the Beanstalk and Rapunzel and Cinderella, and who was the other one? Little Red Riding Hood. And during the 2 hours that it took to watch that movie, I was making money. How cool is that? Pretty cool, I think. I am here with Peter Zapf from Global Sources, and it is my pleasure to introduce him and have him talk to you guys about everything sourcing and imported related. Peter, how are you doing today?
Great, Manny. Thanks so much for having me on today.
That's my pleasure. I'd like to ask, a lot of people don't know who you are or know about your company. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and who Global Sources is?
Sure. No, I've been with Global Sources for, almost 15 years now. We help manufacturers and overseas buyers, importers, wholesalers, and retailers find each other. We run a sourcing site, globalsources.com. Probably our main online competitor is Alibaba. We also run trade shows. We run 3 sets of shows twice a year, April and October every year here in Hong Kong. And we'll have, 20 or 30,000 buyers coming to the show, and we'll have 3,000 booths of exhibitors at each of the shows.
Awesome. That sounds really cool. So I have a very important question to ask you.
Fire away.
What is your favorite and least favorite chewing gum flavors?
Gosh, I haven't chewed gum for about 20 years. So my favorite is juicy fruit. I don't know. Do they even still sell juicy fruit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I think they do.
My least favorite is probably any kind of licorice flavored gum.
Oh, yeah. Those are terrible. All right, cool. So I wanted to ask you, I'm curious, beyond the company, Global Sources, do you also sell on Amazon?
Yeah, so at Global Sources, we have a few suppliers that we're experimenting with. They want to launch their own branded products. So we're helping with their branded products, getting them sold on Amazon. So we've got a little bit of experience selling on Amazon from there.
Okay, great. So almost everybody that listens to our podcast knows about Alibaba, and we always recommend people check them out. It's kind of the go-to for FBA. But I've heard about you guys, Global Sources. I'd like to know what sets you guys apart. How are you guys similar, and how are you different from Alibaba?
Sure. I guess in terms of similarities, we're both online directories of products from mainly China manufacturers. In terms of differences, what folks that use our site have told us is, one, we have a mix of companies that has more factories and fewer trading companies on Global Sources. Second, as a result of the fact that there are more factories, and especially with the factories that are developing their own designs, there are more innovative products on Global Sources, although honestly, the bar is not that high with the manufacturers. But then the third thing is a lot of the suppliers that you see on our site, you can also meet face-to-face at our trade shows. So those are some of the differences. What I would encourage buyers to do is check both, or check all the online sites when you're doing sourcing.
Okay, cool. And they can check out your site at globalsources.com. Is that correct?
That's right. Globalsources.com. Yep.
Okay, cool. And then let's talk about some of the sourcing details. A lot of people ask, at least on our Facebook group, they want to know what seems to be a typical deposit when they're ordering for the first time with a supplier. And almost everybody says 30%. Is that pretty standard with suppliers? Is that pretty standard with your company as well?
Yeah, no, I think it's pretty standard. Again, our company, we don't manufacture or sell. We're just kind of an online directory or a trade show. But what we see in the industry is, 30% is pretty standard for a deposit.
Okay. All right, cool. And do you feel like a seller should, or somebody like us, an FBA seller, should use an inspection company every time they place subsequent orders with suppliers, even if it's, for example, their 10th order? They've been doing it forever with these guys.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was talking about that with another guy a few days ago. I think it's really a question of risk tolerance. Here's some advantages to doing an inspection every time. First, the supplier will continue taking both your orders and the quality of your orders more seriously if he knows there's going to be an inspection every time, right? He's less likely to try to cut corners. The second thing is you got to remember there are a lot of things that can happen on the supplier side. A new salesperson, a new QC lead, new employees on the factory line, new suppliers of components, and all of those changes, you don't know that they're happening. And an inspection helps confirm that none of those types of changes has resulted in a change in the level of quality that you're getting. So I think it's a question of risk tolerance. For me personally, I would say, yeah, do an inspection every time.
Okay. And one of the things that I'm doing now with some of my suppliers is if the inspection fails, I'm asking them to put a clause in the order that says that they'll actually reimburse me for the second time the inspector goes out. Have you seen, is this something that other people are doing? Is it standard? What are your thoughts on that?
Good question. I actually don't know if it's standard. I think it's a good idea. I've talked to people about doing that also. I was talking to Ashish Mongo over IMX Sourcing about this, and he said, yes, he does this as a standard in his contracts, which was interesting. But then he said, in the majority of cases, when it comes time for the supplier to pay for that, they don't pay. So you're kind of getting moral leverage, but keep in mind it's China and everything's negotiable and you may or may not actually get the supplier to pay for that. Mm-hmm. But you end up having moral leverage to say, hey, but you said you would.
Right. So what can you do if the supplier actually refuses?
It's a business decision. Are you still going to be profitable on the order? Are you going to get the quality you want? Do you want to do reorders with the supplier? It's all negotiable. If the supplier refuses, if they're a good supplier, you're getting good quality product and they're going to improve, fine, pay it. You're still going to make money.
Right. What are your thoughts on when you're using an inspection company on what qualifies as a pass and what qualifies as a fail if you were to order?
Yeah. So that's a really hard one. So coming back to your question of the 30% deposit, if we go back a step, mm-hmm. Most folks will be getting samples from multiple suppliers. When you get your samples, you should be looking at them closely and putting together kind of all the things you don't like about them. So you start having an objective, and that's the basis for your objective QC list. And you want it to be as objective as possible. And then on that list, if you're a little bit more advanced, you want to indicate which failures are going to be critical, which are major, and which are minor. Mm-hmm. I don't think that there's, because products vary so much, that there's a specific checklist. That being said, I think there's 3 types of things you want to have on your checklist. The first is function. Does the product work? If it doesn't work, that's a critical failure and it's a fail. Second is appearance. Appearance is interesting because a lot of the suppliers get components from other suppliers, so they may not be able to control the quality of appearance, like small scratches in the product, for instance. The third thing that you want is around packaging and logistics issues like weight of cartons, size of cartons, printing on the cartons. So you want to cover those 3 areas in your QC criteria. Now, interestingly, AsiaInspection.com, one of the inspection companies, if you register for their site, they do have checklists for about 1,000 products, which you can use as a start for your QC checklists. I'd say only as a start because the ones that I've seen need extra work, but they're interesting from the perspective of being a good start.
Okay, and this is a checklist that somebody can go online and download?
That's right. It's AsiaInspection.com. You have to register for the site, and then I don't remember which menu choice it is once you're registered.
Okay, all right. Well, let me ask you this. So let's say you find a supplier, okay? You've gone through the samples, you've narrowed it down to somebody, and you're like, okay, I'm going to go with these guys. What are your thoughts on getting an NDA with one of these guys or some kind of contract?
Yeah. And again, everybody's got a different opinion on this. So ask like 10 other people also. But the first thing is you don't really want an NDA. You can read this up on the ChinaLawBlog.com. But an NDA is that the supplier's not going to disclose something to somebody else. But you're actually not concerned about them disclosing something to somebody else. You're concerned about them developing it themselves and manufacturing it themselves. So in China, what you really want is an NNN, which means non-disclosure, non-circumvent, non-use, if I remember what the 3 N's stand for. So that's the first thing. Then the second question is, well, when do you actually need an NNN? Well, if you're using a supplier-designed product, probably not. If you're doing a crowdfunding project and you've got a lot of IP that you need protected, then you probably do need an NNN and some other contracts. Everything in between is kind of gray. If you're doing a thicker yoga mat, do you need an NDA or an NNN? Probably not, because any other supplier could just copy that very easily. So it kind of comes down to how much IP you have, which kind of relates to, are you using a supplier design, kind of an easy design for anybody to copy that has no IP protection around it, or something that's harder for somebody else to copy that you've put some IP protection around. With the stuff that's harder to copy that you're trying to protect the IP on, then I'd start looking at some of the NNN and other contracts.
Okay. All right. So if that company decides to compete with you and sell on Amazon, and you had that in place, is there anything you can do? Can you really enforce it when the supplier's in China?
Oh, that's a great question. So the first thing is that in order to enforce it in China, you want to make it either Chinese language or bilingual. If it's English language only, then the courts have to go through an extra step of interpreting it. 1. 2, use a lawyer that knows China law. U.S. law is much different than China law. So if you get a U.S. lawyer to draft it and then get it translated, it's probably not going to work. Mm-hmm. And 3, yes, you can win in China courts, especially if the contract is in Chinese. You have a Chinese lawyer write it that understands how China law works, which then means you probably have the right kind of damage clauses in it to get a payout when that happens.
Okay. So it sounds like that would be a pretty serious thing. So you'd probably only want to do that if you were at a certain threshold financially with your product. It's not like somebody's going to be making $1,000 a month and say, you know what, I'm going after these guys. It's for the big guys.
Yeah, no, just first the cost of getting the agreements in place to get that China lawyer, that's probably going to be at least a few $1,000s. And then pursuing it in court is, also expensive.
Okay. Going back to your company and Alibaba, I noticed I haven't been to your site yet to check things out. So my reference is Alibaba, and you can tell me what you guys have as well. But on there, they have suppliers and they have trade companies. Do you guys have the same thing? Do you have trade companies at your site?
Trade companies is an interesting word. Definitely there are manufacturers, and then there are a lot of whatever you want to call it, traders, agents, there's wholesalers, whatever. Mm-hmm. On the Global Sources site, if you go look at the business registration information, you can see how the company has registered themselves. And if they have a word like produce or manufacture, then they're a factory. And also, if they have a higher paid up capital, then they're also a factory, because a factory needs to buy equipment where a service company doesn't. So those are 2 ways to identify whether a company is a factory. When talking to folks that use our site, they say that a higher percentage of the companies listed on Global Sources are factories as compared to agents or trading companies or other intermediaries. So we have both, but I think the mix is a lot different.
Okay. What a lot of people are confused about trade companies versus supplier, the factories. What are your thoughts on the trade companies, and are there advantages or disadvantages to either?
Yeah, there are definitely advantages. But I think, in my personal opinion, what you want is transparency. So in my personal opinion, the first thing that you want, if you have the right size, is to go direct to the factory. But as soon as people go direct to the factory, then they say, oh, wow, this is hard. I need somebody on the ground to help me. And that's where either a trading company or an agent comes in. There are plenty of third-party companies that will provide that kind of service. The question is, how do they do it? Are they going to bill you hourly? Are they going to bill you a fixed fee? Are they going to get a kickback from the manufacturer? Those are the more difficult questions. Now, on our site, we tend to have mostly manufacturers and some trading companies. We don't really have agents on our site.
Let's talk about that, because I haven't actually used an agent. When would it be a good idea to actually use an agent versus going to the suppliers yourself?
Yeah, so we had one of the speakers at our Smart China Sourcing Summit, which we haven't talked about yet, was Chris Thomas, who did a crowdfunded project. They're kind of earmuffs for when you're sleeping so that this outside sound doesn't bother you. Mm-hmm. And he was living in Australia and then Hong Kong. And what he found is he was having trouble because he needed, different cut, different materials. He needed the factory to do a lot of things. So he found an agent to work with that could help him with some of the more complicated things, that understood what he wanted to do and could communicate with the manufacturer, the factory, to do that. So certainly as products get more complicated, that would definitely be an area where, say, a local expert or somebody with some kind of expertise, whether it be expertise in a particular product or expertise in the sourcing process, can be helpful.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So if I'm looking for somebody, if I want to get an agent, you mentioned sometimes they might be hourly, they might have fees, they might get a commission from the factory. What is typical? What can I expect to pay, I guess, if I'm looking for somebody? And would you go after the hourly guy, or would you go after a fee guy, or what would you do?
Yeah, the trading companies historically, and these would be higher volume guys, would work with overseas retailers. I think they work on, 4 to 8% margins. So that's what they would charge. I've seen a lot of different models because the Amazon private label sellers tend to have smaller product volumes, especially when they start. So a fixed fee charge is more typical. Some of the companies, and a number of these guys were speaking at our show, that provide this kind of service include, if you don't mind my listing them.
No.
Import Dojo, Guided Imports, IMEX Sourcing, and Passage Maker. I've also heard folks go to Upwork and, just put up a request for, a sourcing person. I think, the first four are going to be a little bit, they're entrepreneurial, but they're more corporate, Western owned. If you go the Upwork route, well, you're rolling the dice in a different way.
Yeah, for sure. Upwork, it can be tricky. We've got a lot of hours logged on there. But so I guess I'm curious, have you seen price ranges of what it would cost for an agent? If somebody's listening right now, should they expect it's going to be, a few $100s, or are we talking about thousands of dollars, or how does it normally work?
Again, I think it depends on how much work is being done. So if I remember correctly, Guided Imports charges about $1,000 US. I think that's an end-to-end process. They get the samples, they review the samples, they put together the QC guide, they help get the goods, they coordinate getting the goods shipped. I think they also do the product inspection. Right, so that's end-to-end. Other companies like Import Dojo, I think, will have more a la carte services. So they will, if you just want them to identify a few suppliers, they'll do that for, $100. So there really isn't a standard right now, especially when it comes to servicing this new breed of Amazon PL sellers.
Okay, that's good. It's good to know. So let's talk about pricing. I would say that is probably one of the top things people always ask is how to negotiate with their Chinese suppliers, right? And sometimes there's a cultural rift between, say, Americans and the Chinese. And with a lot of the listeners we have, they say, well, they just don't know when to go lower or when to say no to a price. Can you give us your feedback or your thoughts on, I guess, best practices when negotiating with the Chinese?
Yeah, so I'll share what I heard from the larger retailers because, we've been in business for 40 years. So historically, our customers have been larger retailers, including both online at the trade shows. And this is what they tend to do. So they'll do one of two things. And one of these strategies Amazon PL sellers can use. And that is just get multiple quotes from multiple suppliers. Be very clear on your requirements, including, products, features, and functions, any regulatory and safety compliance requirements. Get the quotes. And then effectively, you're playing them off against each other. Hey, I really like you a lot. You've been very communicative. I appreciate the support. Unfortunately, your pricing isn't as competitive as I'm getting from someplace else. Can you be more competitive on pricing? And that way, you at least have a basis for the negotiation, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to just randomly saying, oh, I think this price is too high.
So how do you know, though, when, let's say you've got three prices and you got the lowest priced one, let's say, for whatever reason, they're undercutting the other guys. How do you know that's a good price, though, if it's a product that you've never ordered before?
If you, at the end of the day, if you're going to make money, that's good. But let me then get to the second way of doing it, which is going to be a little bit more difficult for Amazon PL sellers. And that's to do bottom-up pricing. So what I mean by that is get the cost of the raw materials and components, figure out labor costs to assemble or manufacture, add some margin for overhead and factory profit and FOB-related costs if you're buying FOB, and then build up what the correct price is. And this is the other approach that a lot of retailers take, but this is going to be harder for Amazon sellers because you have to do more legwork to figure all of that out.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of stuff there for sure. So, okay. So we talked about negotiating a little bit. Any other best practices that you would want to recommend to listeners when working with Chinese suppliers?
Yes. So we started touching on this earlier, and it's not just working with China suppliers. It's about managing the risk of your order process. Working at global sources, we sometimes see buyers come back and complain about an order or relationship they have with the supplier. So in looking at those complaints, we see a lot of the complaints are due to what we call commercial disputes. And the commercial disputes are generally because there was lack of clarity or communication about requirements between the two parties. So if that's going to be the cause of most problems, then the question is, what steps can you take to avoid those problems? And it comes down to communication and clarity of requirements. So like I was starting to say earlier, the first thing is get samples, use the samples to put together your QC criteria, then include the QC criteria with the purchase order and have the supplier agree to both the purchase order and the QC criteria. Now, if the supplier, and I've seen this happen before, tells you at this point, I cannot meet those QC criteria, good. I mean, you haven't paid the 30%, you need to go find another supplier. And suppliers will sometimes do this because your QC criteria might say, for example, I don't want any blemishes at all on this particular component. And the supplier will say, look, I don't manufacture this particular component. I source it on the open market, and I can't get the level of quality that you want from the suppliers that I source it from. So I can't meet those QC criteria. So we, may need to part ways at this point. Then after the suppliers agreed to both the purchase order and the QC terms and conditions, and also say, hey, and I'm going to get this inspected by a third-party inspection company before it ships, right? So supplier knows everything up front. Supplier knows you're taking quality seriously. Then pay your 30% after suppliers agreed to all of that. After the supplier's manufactured, then get that third-party inspection done to the QC criteria you provided up front. Everybody's very clear on what's required from that order for it to pass. And upon passing the inspection, then pay the remaining 70%. Our estimate is that at least 80% of the problems or commercial disputes we see between buyers and suppliers would be solved just by following this process.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good information. So if you have this QC criteria, the way I look at it is that if I'm dealing with a supplier, they're going to give me their best product. They don't want to give me something that's garbage because they want to have my repeat business. But you're saying if you don't have that QC criteria, they're not going to do that. They're just going to try to, give you the lowest quality product so that they can make the most money? Well,
the thing is, the definition of good quality at a particular price is different in different markets. So, what constitutes good quality in, say, some of the Middle Eastern markets versus what constitutes good quality in Japan are quite different. And the U.S. would be closer to the Japan side of that spectrum than the Middle Eastern side of that spectrum. So the supplier may just not know, which is why it's important to clearly communicate up front what you expect in terms of quality.
So is that something that you should ask them, though? Is your market more for the Middle East, or what are your major markets?
I think that's a great question to ask. I would recommend asking that every time. Because the thing is, suppliers that manufacture for, say, some of the Middle Eastern markets, or they target kind of the low price markets, they've got a whole supply chain and internal mentality. The components they source, the QC processes they have that would need to be changed or upgraded if you want a different level of quality. And that's hard to do, especially for, an entrepreneurial Amazon one-person company PL seller.
Yeah, exactly. Would you walk away from anybody or from a company that serves a specific market, or would you at least give them a chance?
If I have a choice between two and one serves markets closer to the one that I'm targeting, I would go with the one that's closer. There would be cases if you have a super unique product and you can't find anybody else, give them a chance. But in most cases, I try to find someone that has familiarity with the level of quality that you're looking for.
And you mentioned Japan is one that's pretty popular?
Well, no, I just meant on the high side. In terms of the scale of level of quality, the manufacturers will generally tell you Japan is at the super, super high end. Maybe Germany and Korea are high. The U.S. is maybe above average. The different European countries maybe above average. And then Middle Eastern countries, India, Pakistan, maybe lower than average.
All right, cool. So if you tell them, let's say you're getting ready to do your 30% and you tell them that you're going to have an inspector come out to inspect everything before they ship anything. The inspector's coming out prior to you paying the final 70%. Is that correct?
Correct.
And do you feel that the inspection, when you tell them that you're going to have an inspector go out, do they typically do better work than they might otherwise if you don't have an inspector coming out? Have you seen that?
Well, I don't know if I'd use the word typically, but certainly you're putting the supplier on notice that you take QC seriously, and that can never hurt.
Right.
So, a lot of it is about how the signals you're giving the supplier. So by including QC criteria up front, saying you're going to get that third-party inspection done, doing the third-party inspection, the supplier is receiving signals that, you really care about quality. And I feel there's a reasonable chance that they're going to take quality more seriously for your order.
Okay. So a lot of the listeners are already working with Alibaba, and based on recommendations, they're using trade assurance. If they go to global sources, I'm sure you've got a different setup. How do you recommend buyers protect themselves when dealing with new factories?
Yeah, we don't currently have an offering like trade assurance. And trade assurance is kind of insurance for when things go wrong, which isn't, it's kind of, maybe it's a safety net, but it's not really what you want. You can't turn your money into something. You have to go collect on insurance. And, whether it's medical insurance or car insurance or any kind of insurance, my experience is it's always painful to collect on. So we're much more focused on, one, making sure that the manufacturers or suppliers are good and are going to give the buyer a good experience. And second, doing things like we just talked about, which is trying to educate the community on, hey, you're you've got two different cultures working with each other. You have a lot of new people that are new to these business processes. How do you go through these business processes in a way that enables both sides to understand the expectations and both sides to then meet those expectations so that both sides can have a successful order or purchase?
Right. Makes sense. What do you think are some of the things that most FBA private labelers they don't know about when dealing with the Chinese?
An interesting question. So the first one, and this is Ashish at our Smart China conference, said this. The first thing is good factories have plenty of business and probably don't need your business.
Okay.
So treat them well. The guys that are chasing you, I'm not going to say yes or no, but good factories do not have excess capacity, and you may have to convince them to work for you. And those may be the guys that you want to work with. So don't assume that they're hungry for your 1,000 piece order.
Yeah, that would make sense. Okay. Are there? I know we're going to be jumping into freight forwarding here shortly, but any final strategic issues you think sellers should be thinking about? Yeah,
we were talking about this before we started, and one of the things that we said was, you were talking about supply chain costs. And, a couple years ago on Amazon, the issue was you're competing for the buy box. So everybody wanted to go private label so they could own the buy box, which is great. But now you have 10 people selling or 40 people selling the same thing, just not the same buy box, just 40 different results in the search results. Mm-hmm. And you start wondering, who's going to win that long term? Are 40 people really going to survive? And as these situations get more mature, it tends to be the people that either have the better supply chain costs, or better marketing, or a combination of the two, that end up winning. So, because the better supply chain costs means that you can allocate either more money to profit, you can price lower and still be profitable, or allocate more money to marketing. So then the question is, well, how are you going to optimize your supply chain costs, after we get out of this Wild West land grab mentality and get into a more mature, level sales mentality? And there's a number of things. The first thing is you want to get your unit costs as low as possible, which probably means ordering in larger volumes. Depending on your size of your product, you may end up ordering in container quantities. Second is your shipping costs, because for a lot of, and again, this varies from product to product, but you may want to start looking at ocean shipping versus air shipping, because for some products, that can be a difference of a few dollars per unit. There are other little things like the size of the packaging so that you can get more units in the container, shipping direct to FBA so you get goods to FBA faster, rather than shipping them to yourself for a reinspection. All of those types of supply chain things will enable you to have a lower cost, which enables you to compete for longer and make money for longer with your product. Those are some of the strategic issues that I think people will be thinking about next.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. So very serious question here before we get into freight forwarding. Why do the Chinese always call me dear?
Yeah, that's a funny one. And the answer is, I don't know. And you know what? I think I will have to ask when I go to the trade show today. I'll ask some of the suppliers that. My guess is somewhere they're just taught to do that.
Okay, good. I'm not the only one then. Perfect.
No, you're not the only one.
All right. So freight forwarding, this has me completely baffled. I do it, but I outsource it completely. And so I know almost nothing about it. So I wanted to get an expert on. We have questions about this all the time on our Facebook group. And I just don't know how to answer some of the stuff. So let's talk about the basics first. We've covered FOB. In fact, if you want to talk about the acronyms here and some of the popular ones, that'd be fantastic.
Okay. So first of all, use the word expert. Please don't call me an expert. I have experience in some of this stuff, and I can share based on my experience. But I always get worried with this stuff when people call themselves experts. And I'll try to get all of these acronyms right. But FOB is probably the one that the audience needs to know the most or the best, especially for ocean shipping. And FOB usually means that you're taking legal possession of the products after they cross the rail of the ship. So once the goods are on the ship, you have legal possession. That's what FOB means.
Okay.
And I think that stands for freight on board. Also frequently used term is EXW, ex-works. And that means you take legal possession of the goods after they leave or when they leave the factory gate. So there's a couple differences between the two. With FOB, the supplier is paying for getting the goods shipped from the factory to the port. And the supplier is generally, this gets a little bit more complicated, is generally taking responsibility for the export paperwork and ensuring that export licenses and stuff are in place. Because of the export license issues, which I am neither an expert nor very experienced on, I would say try to stick with FOB because with X Works, it can get a little bit more complicated.
Okay, that's good to know.
But you can also look up, Google the Incoterms. I think it's INCO terms. There's always, go to the image search. There's a bunch of tables that show not just FOB and EXW, but there's probably 12 different phrases. CIF is cost, insurance, and freight. So that would be the supplier pays it kind of everything except for duty to you, because that includes insurance and freight. And DDP is delivered duty paid, which means they pay insurance, freight, and duty and get it to you. And I think that the way Amazon buyers are buying for air shipments is very CIF-like, because you're asking the supplier to take on and manage the air shipment costs. But for ocean shipments, it tends to be more FOB.
Yeah, my last shipment that I had, my supplier handle, they actually have their own freight forwarder. This is going to sound really crazy to you probably, but I didn't even know the name of the freight forwarder. I was just dealing with my supplier, and they said, they're a big supplier, and they said, yep, we'll take care of it. We do, hundreds of orders to Amazon every month. And they did it, and they gave me a price. Once they knew the three factories, or the three warehouses that it was going to, they gave me a price, and they said, Dad, this is going to be your price, and that's the delivered price, door to door. So they didn't use any of the acronyms or anything like that. Have you heard of stuff like that? Is that normal?
Did they ship by air or by ocean?
That one was, there's two. That particular one that was delivered was by air.
So air, that can make sense, because for air, they'll probably just use a courier like UPS or FedEx, and UPS and FedEx, can drop stuff off at the Amazon warehouses anytime. For ocean, and that's where it would be, I wouldn't say surprising, but not something that I've heard before. Because for ocean, you need an importer of record. And I'm not sure who would have acted as the importer of record in that kind of transaction, one. And two, if you were buying FOB, which meant that you had legal ownership or legal title when the goods passed or got on the boat, then suddenly you have kind of legal title and you don't know where the goods are. And they're not in control of a freight forwarder that kind of you own. So I'm not saying that you can't do it. There are just, some additional risks involved.
Interesting. Do you find that freight forwarders in China are typically less expensive than you would find here in the US? And is it by a large margin?
That's one also that I don't have a lot of experience on. I'd say bigger picture freight costs have really plummeted compared to a couple of years ago. There's an overcapacity of freight space. And a lot of the costs for ocean freight are somewhat fixed. There are port fees on both sides, plus then the space in the container. What most people that I talk to say is just get a couple quotes for your shipment and judge the cost that way.
Okay. And what kind of money can a typical private labeler save when ordering via ship or sea versus, let's say, express air in terms of percentages?
Yeah, it totally depends on the size and weight of the product. Like if you've got one of the examples that I saw, Sam Boyd from Guided Imports, he did water bottles, plastic water bottles, and he did some calculations on it. And water bottles, they're not big, but they're light. And as you know, for air shipping goes by the greater of volumetric weight or physical weight. So water bottles would be something that would ship by volumetric weight, right? It might weigh, 10 kg, but they might charge you 40 kg just because it uses so much volume. And in his calculations, the water bottle for air shipping was about $6 each, and for ocean shipping was about $1 each. So there you're saving $5 per unit going by ocean versus air.
Wow. And that includes, is that the final price delivered or that, for both of them?
No, that would be just the freight costs, right? So that doesn't include product fees. But for the ocean freight costs, that would include the origin port fees, the destination port fees, the freight space fees. Because, for a container, you can move a container of goods for, $2,500. So if you've got 2,500 pieces in that container, that's $1 a piece.
Okay, so that's a typical price, $2,500, and that's to get it here. And here's the thing I'm confused on, because I've had quotes from, it was a different supplier in China, and the shipping fee itself was really low, but then by the time you added in, it seemed like there was about 30 other fees.
Right.
It ended up it was like, it jumped up quite a bit. It was a lot closer to what the express air fee was going to be. I mean, there was still a good difference, but it wasn't as low. It wasn't like 1/6, like you just mentioned, where it was $1 versus $5 or $6.
Yeah, again, the example that I was giving was kind of a full container.
Okay.
Right, so that's 10 or 11 pallets of goods. You would never airship that much.
Right.
There's certainly a break-even point, because with ocean shipping, there are fixed costs. There are the port fees on both sides that are just fixed. So numbers people have said, and I haven't validated these with math, but if you're at 3 cubic meters or less, or if you're at 150 kg or less, it makes sense to do air instead of ocean, right? There are just too many fixed costs in ocean for it to make sense. But as your shipment volume gets bigger, ocean starts making a lot of sense.
Okay, you said 150 kilograms, or what was it? 100 cubic?
3 cubic meters, call it 3 cubic yards.
3 cubic yards. Okay.
But again, do your own math on your own products.
Right. So, but generally speaking, so if you're over 150 kg, or 3 cubic yards, then it becomes more.
I mean, start looking at it, start comparing. And my guess is for your shipment, where if they were close, you're kind of at that break-even point. And, at that break-even point, go by air. You'll turn over your cash faster, unless you want to do it to learn ocean.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So, and then typically, if you're bringing this stuff into the States, I've been seeing, I think the last shipment I did, by the time it got to Amazon, took about 6 weeks. Does that seem about normal?
Yeah, that's within the range. I mean, I think the on the ocean time is, call it 18 days, maybe a little less, maybe a little bit more, also depending from which port you're going. But then there's usually, a few days on each side of the port. Then U.S. Customs has to clear it. Then your freight company has to pick it up. One other thing on the quotes, that you were mentioning earlier, there's two things that make apples for apples comparisons of quotes sometimes different. And that's the inland freight. So if you're getting a quote FOB, then your supplier's taking care of inland freight on the China side, right? Getting the freight from their factory to the port. You want to make sure that when you get multiple quotes for freight forwarding on the U.S. side, that either they include or don't include inland freight, because the inland freight can be very material to the total cost. The second thing to watch out for is the customs duties. I think most freight forwarders do not quote customs duties, but they will charge you for them afterwards. So, don't be surprised when that extra bill comes in.
And you're saying that the bill will come in from the actual shipping company or from the freight forwarder? Yeah,
because usually the freight forwarder pays it on your behalf, and then you pay them, if I understand that correctly.
Okay. So, and I guess that's one of the things that confuse me. So if I'm buying things and sending them out via Express Air, they say, hey, it's going to cost you $2,000 to send the stuff in. So $2,000, they ship it, and it arrives at Amazon's warehouses. That's it, right? I'll have some duty fees. Or unless it's duty free. But with the if you're sending it by ship, it gets to the port out here, but then there could be additional costs to actually get those things put on a truck and then sent out.
And what most freight forwarders will do is they'll quote. What would be common? There'd be two types of quotes that are common. One is to our warehouse, right? So the freight forwarder says, we'll quote you everything to our warehouse. Mm-hmm. And then you'll need to go into Seller Central and set up the Amazon appointed carriers to pick it up from the warehouse. The second way to do is the freight forwarder will quote all the way to the Amazon warehouses. So you just need to be clear on which type of quote you're getting, again, in that apples for apples comparison.
Okay. Do you feel it's necessary or advantageous to have the products come to a U.S. warehouse for inspection before it gets reshipped over to Amazon?
I think it totally depends on the product. In general, I think one wants to move toward not needing to re-inspect the product. And really, what does inspection in a warehouse in the U.S. mean? Does it mean making sure that the shipping cartons are not damaged, or does it mean unpacking products and looking at the units inside the unit cartons? In general, what I understand most people are doing is they're trying to get everything done in China, the QC, the inspection, and then they have good packaging so that the product will survive the shipment well, so that it doesn't require additional inspection on the U.S. side.
Okay. Let's talk about that. What kind of packaging do you recommend in terms of the cardboard thicknesses for the boxes and corner protectors or whatever else there might be?
Amazon has their recommendations or requirements. I think it's less than 50 pounds per carton, less than 1,500. I forget if it's pounds or kg for a pallet. They want cartons with a certain edge crush strength. You can get all these requirements and just share them with your supplier and say, this is what we need. And that should put you in pretty good shape for the master cartons. For the unit products, each product is different. How much foam or bubble wrap or whatever do you need inside the product to prevent it from getting damaged during transit really depends on the product. If it's a glass product, you need to be a heck of a lot more careful.
Yeah, right.
If it's a metal or plastic product, you may not need to be as careful.
Okay. Yeah, I've had products sent out to me here first for inspection, especially when I was first starting out. And there was a a massive difference between two suppliers. One of them, the box was, or the master carton was considerably thinner than one of the other ones that came in really intact and it looked awesome, or the other one was thinner and the corners were kind of crushed in, which crushed, a few of the units, the internal boxes of those units, I should say. The products themselves were okay.
And this comes back to the communication. And as part of the QC requirements, I would definitely put in, and these are my requirements for the master carton and for the unit boxes.
Okay. All right. That's good to know. What about the made in China stickers? You see that on so many things, and I've talked to people and a ton of people just aren't doing it. How important is that?
No, I think it's a regulatory requirement, but if I understand correctly, it's a poorly enforced regulatory requirement. So in the US, there are a lot of regulatory requirements, and sad to say, many of them are not well enforced. So you're kind of rolling the dice.
Okay. Does it matter where it is? I mean, does it have to be actually on the product, or can it be on the unit's box? Or
again, this is not something that I'm 100% familiar with.
Okay.
If you want to be safe, put it on the product, put it on the unit box, put it on the master carton.
Okay. Get it everywhere.
I should actually check. I would ask the folks at Cascadia Product Testing Solutions, Rachel Greer. She'd be a good one to answer that question.
Okay. Cool. What about if the product, you've got it on a ship, let's just say it's damaged or lost or something happens. When you're using freight forwarders, is that automatically covered, or do you have to get additional insurances for that, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so the first thing is we'll assume that you bought FOB so that, you once it's on the ship, you kind of have title and own the product. And then second, yes, when you get your quotes from your freight forwarder, there'll always be a checkbox or a question, do you want insurance? And if you check that box and get insurance, then you can make a claim. If you don't check that box, then I don't think you can make a claim.
Okay. Is it pretty standard? I mean, from what you've seen from clients, are most of them getting that insurance?
This is not something I've asked folks whether they usually get the insurance or not. And I think the insurance is, if I remember correctly, it's 0.5% or 1% of the order value.
Okay.
So
it's really low.
Yeah. It's again, an issue of risk tolerance and whether you want insurance or not.
Yeah. Have you heard any stories of people just completely losing their packages, their shipment?
Not many. I mean, the stories that I hear more are things like, hey, the product got to the US, it didn't clear customs because it didn't have the FDA approvals it needed, so the product got destroyed.
Okay, so here's a scenario that I was thinking about. If Amazon is they charge 30 cents per unit to do placement service. So instead of me giving 3 different warehouses to my supplier, I can have everything shipped to one and then have everything just brought in and shipped, put it on a truck and then it goes to that one warehouse versus them then having to split everything up, put it on 3 different trucks, right?
Yep.
So in that type of a scenario, could it be potentially cheaper to do that placement service, have it all go to one place versus actually splitting it up the way Amazon wants?
Yeah, I think, and if I remember correctly, it's 30 cents, or more, because it's partly weight-based.
Correct.
This is an interesting supply chain cost optimization question. I think the first question is when you set up your, what's it called, the fulfillment order in Seller Central, is Amazon going to send it to multiple fulfillment centers or not? What I've seen more recently is they're only sending stuff to one fulfillment center for some orders. So that's great. Then you solve the 30-cent problem. You don't have to pay the 30 cents.
Yeah.
But if they do send it to multiple fulfillment centers, then you need to think about, does that make sense or not? And if you want to optimize your costs, what you can do is you can figure that out before the supplier has palletized goods. So you can tell the supplier, hey, palletize the goods so that these 2 pallets go to this fulfillment center, these 3 pallets go to this other fulfillment center, and these 2 pallets go to this third fulfillment center. Now, the advantage of that is you don't have to break down the pallets in the US where labor costs are higher, break down and rebuild them. The disadvantage is you may not be optimizing the use of space in the container. So that ends up depending on, how the pallets are configured and how much product you can get on each pallet.
That makes sense. So I was just thinking, though, you mentioned that you typically see Amazon having you send everything to one warehouse. Are you speaking specifically about palletized products?
Yes. What I've seen and I have a lot more experience with the ocean stuff than the air stuff. What I've been seeing is more comments that for the ocean stuff, Amazon is increasingly, I'm certainly not saying always, is increasingly requesting stuff be sent to one fulfillment center instead of multiple fulfillment centers. I don't know why.
Yeah, no, hopefully that's the case. I haven't been doing too many palletized orders. Speaking of which, for those listeners that don't know what palletized even means, can you briefly describe that?
Sure. So the pallet, if you go to the grocery store parking lot, you see those wooden things that basically the forklift sticks the fork into to pick up the wooden thing that has a bunch of master cartons or cartons of stuff above it. That's the pallet. And usually they're made out of wood. And Amazon, I think, requires that stuff that comes in through the Amazon appointed less than container load carriers be palletized, which means the cartons are stacked on a pallet so that they can be moved around with a forklift very easily.
Okay, great. Speaking of things being palletized, a great little gem that came from your expo, from your sourcing summit, came from Anthony Chen. I guess this was he works with Flexport, is that correct?
Yeah, Flexport is one of the online freight forwarders.
Okay. He was talking about hiding valuable cargo. So for example, if I think in his example, he was talking about importing tablets, and because it's something that could have potential high theft rates, he suggested using black shrink wrap to cover the pallets, that there would be no actual cost difference between the black and the clear stuff. I never thought about this, but is there a reason not to use black shrink wrap all the time? And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, great question. My first answer is, I don't know. I'll have to ask him that as a follow-up question. But my second thought would be, maybe customs would get upset if they can't see what's in, products more often. So you have to maybe balance is customs going to get upset versus is there going to be theft or inventory shrinkage if people see what it is. But either way, I'd ask the freight forwarder what they think.
Okay. Earlier you were talking about trying to fill up a container, and if you're using pallets incorrectly, you might not fill those containers. How much do you need to actually fill up an entire container, and what are the advantages of doing so versus doing partial filling? Let's say you do a third of it or something like that.
I think that the volume of a container, a 20-foot container is, I don't remember, 30 cubic meters. But anyway, there's some volume. And if they put the pallets in correctly, they can get 9, 10, or 11 pallets in, depending on whether product is overhanging the edges of the pallets or not. At the end of the day, you need to work with your supplier to figure out how are they going to stack products on the pallets, how much can they get on the pallet before they hit the weight limit. But at the end of the day, because of the fixed costs for the port fees on both sides, the incremental costs for using more space in a pallet are quite low. So if you're going to pay, let's just say you're going to pay $1,500 to get a half a container for 1,000 units. You might pay, let's just say, $2,000 for a full container for 2,000 units.
Oh, wow. So
then you're going from $1.50 a unit to $1 a unit. That's a savings of 50 cents a unit for moving from a partial container to a full container. Now that's just a very rough example. Everybody needs to do the math on their own products.
Right. Okay. What if you're ordering from the same supplier, you've got multiple products? Do all the products, if they're different SKUs, have to be palletized separately?
No, Amazon does not require different SKUs to be palletized separately. They just require all of the goods to be, somewhere on all the pallets in the shipment.
All right. That's good to know. And then if you're dealing with, you were talking about trying to fill up a container because, the additional cost is minimal, let's say, versus half a container. If you're ordering from different suppliers, is it better to try to, let's say they're a week or 2 weeks apart in their production schedule, kind of wait until you have everything and then get that all sent over at the same time and put into one container?
I hate to say it again, but that's another one where it depends on how the numbers work out. Definitely you can get them consolidated. The freight forwarder can usually help with that. I was talking to a couple folks about this question also, and what they suggest is buy FOB and have the freight forwarder consolidate into a single shipment. But then you want to think about the time difference and whether that's causing you other problems like cash flow problems or you're out of inventory or other issues. But definitely it is possible to consolidate orders from multiple suppliers and have your freight forwarder do that.
Okay, so you would just talk to the freight forwarder and let them deal with the factories and handle that all for you then?
Yes.
All right, great. So here's one that really has a lot of people confused, including myself. But when should a seller be worried about any compliance codes or certifications, whatever they're called, for all the different products that are coming in? Because you were talking about earlier, the made in China thing, nobody really cares about that. But do they care if a product's coming in and it's a toy that a kid's going to put in his mouth and you need specific, certifications for?
I would say always, but everybody that I've talked to says that the Amazon PL sellers are, and it's not just in the US, it's in Europe also, are really not doing a good job of understanding regulatory compliance requirements and following the regulatory compliance requirements. There's a couple different risks. One is that your goods get stopped by customs and then they get destroyed. They're not compliant, boom, they're not coming in the country. Second is that you get fined. They come into the country, they sell, and you get fined by one of the government authorities. Third risk, probably around safety issues. is that if there is a safety problem, like hoverboards blowing up, that you'll get sued. And if you don't have the safety certifications in place, then the odds of you losing that suit or losing more money in that suit would seem to be higher. So, a lot of this is about risk and risk mitigation. I would say try to understand the regulatory and safety requirements for your products, definitely. And at some point, it seems like, and Rachel Greer, who used to work at Amazon, said this also, at some point it seems like Amazon is going to get a little bit stricter on ensuring that the private label products meet regulatory requirements.
Okay, so regarding the certifications, is this something that if your supplier says they have the certifications in place and they're from China, does that work for you, or do you have to get your own certifications when you're bringing it into the U.S.?
I'd always say ask but verify. You are the importer of record when you're bringing goods into the U.S., so it is your legal responsibility to make sure that those certifications and standards, safety standards, are being met. The way to figure out a little bit more conclusively is to go to your inspection company and say, hey, here's the product. What are the regulatory requirements that I need to be aware of and that I need to meet? And then you can ask the inspection company, hey, for this product, can I use, one, can I use what the supplier has? Two, whatever the supplier tells you when you verify, go try to find an online third-party database that you can verify that it's real and that it's there. There are Photoshop certifications that float around or that suppliers share. And I did hear a story probably a couple weeks ago of a buyer who imported some stuff. The supplier said they had the certification. And then the regulatory authority requested certification from the buyer. Buyer went back to the supplier to ask for it. And supplier said, oops, my bad. Sorry, we didn't really have it.
Oh, geez. So where would somebody go? Where does a seller go to find out exactly what they need and to find out, if their supplier actually has this?
This is a great question because for the U.S., there is no one single database that will give you a clear list of what you need. So the first place that I would go is your inspection company. And there's a range of things you can do. You can ask the supplier, hey, Mr. Supplier, what are other people asking for? You can ask your inspection company. You can ask your freight forwarder. Sometimes they know. You can do online internet research. You can hire a lawyer that specializes in this and ask them. That tends to be the most expensive route. Or you can hire kind of an independent third party. The Cascadia Product Testing Solutions does this. It'll do the research for you and tell you what you need. So there's a lot of ways to do it, but they all cost money and take time.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And I've dealt with suppliers that they'll send me the images of their certifications, and I've used those and I haven't had any issues. But I'm like, man, just like you said, one of these days I'm going to get with a new supplier and they're going to say they've got it, and that would be, I guess, a horrible situation. You get everything into port and then you don't have it, and you said they could even destroy the products.
Yeah, again, depending on the compliance issue and the product.
So if your supplier has the certifications, the countries each have their own certifications, right? So they might have a certification for China, but not for the U.S. So is that right? And would you need to ask that specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. Every country has their own certification or regulatory compliance or safety requirements. So you need to understand your countries, which, for most listeners will be folks selling in the U.S., regulatory and safety requirements, and make sure that those are the ones you're asking for and those are the ones that are being met.
All right, great. One of your speakers at your sourcing summit had mentioned that some of the FDA regulatory compliance paperwork or I guess certificates, there was one called the ASTM regulatory compliance. They're not that expensive typically. You can get them for under $1,000. Is that kind of normally what they go for, or is there a vast range?
I was asking the folks at Asia Inspection, I said, hey, wouldn't it be easy to just do a list of, regulatory compliance requirements, the tests that are required for those and how much they cost? And they said, yeah, we have one of those. It's 40 pages long. And I said, okay, can we do a list of just the ones that are used more frequently? So the data's there. Like you said, a couple of the examples that I saw were in the, call it $300 to $800 range for some of the compliance testing. Now, some of the safety testing, like UL testing for electronics, that can be more like $10,000.
Oh, wow.
So it can vary, quite a bit depending on what's required to achieve that certification.
Okay. And this is really good information. So let's say that you're just getting going and you want to find out what code your product is even in. For example, if I'm importing small plastic toy cars, is my code going to be for plastics or is it going to be for toys? And I imagine that could be a big difference because some things are duty free and some aren't, right?
Yeah. So what you're talking about is the HS code or the HTS code. And somebody explained to me the difference between those two. I think one is used in the US and one is used in the rest of the world. But it's basically the classification. It's a 6, 8, or 10 digit number. And I think the number of digits varies by country. that classifies the product. And then once the product is classified, there's a duty rate tied to that product classification. So the thing is, you can go online at a site like dutycalculator.com, or even there's a giant PDF file in a directory that you can search, U.S. government, I forget the site, and you can search through it. The thing is, at the end of the day, it's the government inspector guy who sees your information coming through that decides. So for instance, one of my friends was importing buttons, but they were the buttons for an old Jeep, you know, the horn button, not a shirt button, but it was described as buttons. So the guy that decided what the duty rate would be said, oh, these are shirt buttons. They get that rate. And then, afterwards, my friend had to go and, appeal it and say, whoa, hold on. These are not shirt buttons. These are buttons for a horn on a Jeep, and that's a different duty rate. So we should have a lower duty rate, and we need to get a refund on the duties that we paid.
Okay. And so you can do that after the fact then?
You can, but I would not, it's government bureaucracy, right? I would not encourage it as part of your normal business practice.
Okay. So let's just say it gets through the port, everything's good, and it gets over to Amazon. Have you heard of scenarios where Amazon then requires or needs this these compliance paperwork?
Well, I think they did with the hoverboards, right?
Yeah, actually, I don't know. I know they were blowing up, so that probably raised a lot of flags. So
yeah, no, I think then they went out and they asked people, hey, give us this, this certification paperwork, or else, and I don't remember if it was both, we're not going to sell your products anymore, and we're going to destroy the inventory.
Okay. So going back to I think you call it the HS codes. The HS code is pretty important then relative to the regulatory documents you might need, right? Because if you use the wrong HS code, you would need specific paperwork versus something else.
So the HS codes are almost exclusively only for the duty rates.
Okay.
In order to figure out safety or other regulatory compliance issues, they're different government organizations. As far as I know, they're largely unrelated or not related to the HS codes.
So what code is it that would cause you to have to provide or to have some kind of proof of documentation?
It's more a product description. Like, just for instance, for lighting, California has energy requirements for lamps and LED lamps. So it's an LED lamp, boom. It falls within the scope of those California energy requirements.
Okay. So it's not automated then. Somebody's actually looking at this and going, okay, this needs this particular regulatory certification.
And this is why third-party expertise is so valuable in addressing what's required and what's not required.
Okay. So if you're using an inspection company, using inspection companies right there in China that go out, does it really matter who you use? Is there a specific place that you would recommend people go to find the right company?
Well, there are a bunch of inspection companies, the old school tier 1 inspection companies, and I don't know how good they are working with Amazon private label sellers, right? Because the private label sellers don't generate as many inspections per year as, say, a Walmart. But that would be Bureau Veritas, SGS, TUV, and Intertech. And all of them also own labs. So they can all tell you what the regulatory requirements would be, or safety requirements for a product. I'll call it the next group of inspection companies that I think are more receptive to working with these smaller, inspections per year, Amazon private label sellers. They include companies like Asia Inspection, Asia Quality Focus, InTouch Quality, VTrust, ProQC. There's a bunch of them. But these companies are a very, very, very good first place to check what are the regulatory requirements for this product in this country. And if they can help you, great. If they can't, then you need to go to plan B, which might be find a specialist. It would be a safer way. Do some internet research is helpful, but may not be as comprehensive. Okay.
Would you ever let your supplier choose the codes for you before shipping things out to you?
I think you can. So again, this comes to the duty rates. I think I'd be happy to ask the supplier, hey, what HS codes do you normally use? We were trying to capture HS codes from suppliers. And it turns out that because the HS codes are a little bit different in each country, they often don't know because it's the destination country's code. So they often don't know the exact code. So I think you can ask them and that'll narrow it down and give you guidance, but you should still go double check. The worst that'll happen is you'll be surprised by having a higher or lower duty rate than you expected.
All right. And if let's go back to the compliance certifications and things you need, are those things pretty fast? Is it just a matter of a few days or does it take a long time?
If I understand correctly, a lot of these lab tests take 2 to 3 weeks. I believe that something like a UL safety certification may take longer, 4 to 6 weeks, if I remember correctly.
And that's taking the product and you have to bring it into the U.S. to actually send to a lab here? Is that how it works? Or is it done there in China?
No, there are labs in China also. If you're doing it through your inspection company, they'll have preferred and trusted lab service providers.
Okay. All right.
And also it depends on the test. Many of the tests can be done in China. I would suspect that there are some specialized tests that are not done in China yet.
Okay. And I saw a particular listing of inspectors, and they were a few $100s typically. There's probably like 20 or 30 of them on there, different companies. Does that seem really low, or is that something that you would say is normal? What are you suggesting?
The inspection companies that I listed previously all charge about $300 per man day.
Okay.
And for an Amazon private label order, typically will not require more than one man day for the product inspection. So those would be typical charges. I have seen reports of, I'll say, entry-level local inspection companies that are charging as little as $100 per man day. I don't have experience and I'm not familiar with those companies, so I don't really know the difference in the service level that you get from them.
All right, great. So let's talk about continuous bonds. That's something that I hear freight forwarders talking about. Can you tell us what that is and when do you need it?
Right. So if you're importing goods, and I'm going to talk about by ocean, I'm not as clear on this for air freight. You either have to pay a $100 bond, and if I understand correctly, it's a bond to make sure that you're going to pay the customs duties. You have to pay either $100 per shipment, or you can get a continuous bond, which allows you an unlimited number of shipments over a 12-month period. And the continuous bond, I think it depends on who you get it through. I believe the range of numbers is between $300 and $600. So your break even ends up being 3 to 6 shipments per year. If you're going to do more than 6 shipments per year, get a continuous bond.
Okay. On the flip side, is there an amount that you can import into the U.S. without incurring any fees?
So I believe that the threshold was recently raised to $800 US.
Okay. So it's really low.
Yes.
All right. So if you've got a $1,500 shipment, I guess technically if somebody wanted to be thrifty, they could break it into 2 shipments and send it that way. Is that right?
Yeah. So, and then it depends on what's the duty rate. I mean, a 3% duty rate on $1,500 is what, $45.
Yeah. By
splitting it into 2 shipments, you're probably going to incur more than an incremental $45 in costs. But I mean, it depends on the math.
That makes sense. Right. Okay. Well, let's talk about small factories versus large factories. I mean, that's your company. You deal with factories all the time. I've heard it's oftentimes, it's better to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond than the other way around when dealing with suppliers. So what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that there's advantages and disadvantages for both approaches. I mean, the advantage of the larger factories, they tend to have more experience. They tend to be working with the larger retailers. Certainly the disadvantage is your order is a small order and it will likely get bumped for one of their better customers if, it comes to that. But the larger factories may have capabilities that the smaller factories don't. On the other hand, the smaller factories, like you said, where you're a bigger fish in a smaller pond, you may get better service. You may be able to get more changes, or your timelines hit more regularly. So, both have advantages and disadvantages.
Okay, that makes sense. And then would you recommend that all your packaging, your labels, the FN SKUs made in China, all that stuff get done by your supplier there in China?
Yes.
Just all at the same place, because it doesn't cost much more, right? So we're talking about cents typically.
Yes. But I would also say as part of your QC requirements, get all of that stuff from Amazon on the palletizing requirements, the carton weight requirements, the carton size requirements. Make that a standard part of your requirements list. You can reuse it, with every supplier, mm-hmm. and share that with the suppliers upfront with your purchase order, so they know what you want to do and they can price it in appropriately.
Okay, I'm going to be jumping around here because as we talk about things, you'll remind me of something that I didn't ask, but. For pallets, or actually for ship containers, if you're doing half a ship container or a full ship container, is it a requirement that everything be on pallets?
I believe with Amazon, it's a requirement that things be on pallets. I heard a story from one person where they got a container of stuff that wasn't palletized, and it took them like 2 hours to unload the container because they had to hand carry each carton out. So I believe it is a requirement, yes.
So Amazon will say if you... I guess there's a number. I don't even know what the number is. If there's a certain number of boxes in a particular order, do they require a pallet then? Because I haven't seen that when I'm ordering. I've done stuff where it's like 167 cartons, master cartons, and it doesn't. and I'm not selecting palletize or anything like that, and everything goes through.
Is that air shipping or ocean shipping? I think for air, because it's going by courier, they'll take one pallet at a time. But for ocean and air freight, I'm not as familiar with. But for ocean freight, I believe it has to be palletized.
Okay. So that's a good point. So you're mentioning air freight. So there's express air, which we talked about, which people can get, in 4 to 7 days, sometimes even faster. I've seen it just recently where it was real quick. But when you're talking about air freight, it's like the air version of sea shipping, right? It takes a little bit longer. Can you tell us about using airplanes and what the difference is between that and sea shipping?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that. I mean, like you said, it's going to be faster. It's going to be more expensive. I think that the goods are more likely to need to be palletized. And like you said, my understanding, it's the air equivalent of ocean freight.
Okay, that makes sense. I haven't actually used that. That's the one thing I haven't done. So can you recommend, well, actually, we talked about inspection companies. Do you have a particular place that you ever recommend people go?
I think, the ones that I listed earlier are all reputable inspection companies.
Okay, at the beginning.
I mean, I can run through them again, or...
No, that's fine. So do they, if you've got suppliers in different cities, for example, do they handle all that? Or